Shout out Toxic in the chat. How's it going, Toxic? Thank you for popping in one more time. You don't need the fantasy football help, I don't think. I didn't see actually the results from the waiver or from the Vampire League that we do for friends of the Twitch program here. But Toxic didn't need any help in week 1. Oh, we had a bad week 2. What happened, Toxic? Who let us down here? Who let Toxic down in week 2? Watching the show while eating brunch. Oh. Shout out brunch. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. What happened? Oh, we had a rough week. We had a tough one there, Toxic. That's fair. Mike Evans let us down. Jamar Chase let us down. Sam Laporta. It would be quicker to go through the guys who didn't let us down. That is fair. So today we're gonna help out people like Toxic who had a tough week too. People like me who had a very difficult week too, and hopefully people like you. So let's get into it. We will start at the quarterback position. If you are looking for a quarterback streamer, if you are like me in the Vampire League and actually in a couple other leagues, and you have Justin Herbert, it might be time to move on. So we are going to look at a couple of quarterbacks that you should be looking at in fantasy football because there's a couple. There aren't a lot, admittedly. It feels like teams have been going a little bit more backup heavy in fantasy because the number of quarterbacks who are available in what meets our threshold of 35% or lower, there aren't many actually out there, but we do have a couple gems this week. At 5% owned, it's Gardner Minshew. The Raiders offense finally started to look competent at the end of that game against the Baltimore Ravens, and this isn't a ringing endorsement of the Vegas Raiders offense or Gardner Minshew as a fantasy quarterback. This is entirely based on the Carolina Panthers and how bad they are. The Raiders play the Panthers this week. The Raiders, who have scored, a combined 38 points in 2 weeks, are favored by 7 this week against Carolina. There is no anticipation that the Panthers are going to do anything well. Daniel Jeremiah was on Rich Eisen's show, and Daniel Jeremiah, I think, is one of the I think, honestly, the best talent evaluator in broadcasting right now. And he said the Carolina Panthers are the least talented team he has seen in 21 years around the National Football League. Tough to argue. And so you get a quarterback who can play them. You have him with Devontae Adams, who made an unbelievable catch to keep that game going for the Raiders on Sunday. Brock Bowers feels like a legitimate thing. And another thing working in Minshew's favor, this team can't run the ball for shit. So they have to throw it a lot as well. So I think that helps out Gardner Minshew. We go from one Raider quarterback to a former Raider quarterback in Derek Carr. He is 20% owned. And again, I know suggesting that you pick up Derek Carr is enough to make Toxic potentially choke on his brunch. Hopefully he didn't. But that's not something I anticipated doing 2 weeks into this season. But things are moving well now for New Orleans. Derek Carr hasn't led a drive this season that has ended in a punt. It has been nothing but points for him. That's probably going to change at some point. However, I don't know if that's going to be this week. We all last night saw Philadelphia's defense against what is left of Kirk Cousins. And there are, I think, some holes there. 2 teams have now been able to pass on the Philadelphia Eagles. Mooney was wide open in big stretches of that game. And so I do think that there are going to be some options for Derek Carr to take advantage of. One thing we didn't necessarily anticipate with New Orleans offense this season is the breakout of Shaheed. He has been a huge part of what this team is doing. The offensive line has held up. Kamara has turned back the clock. Olave with a much better week last week, but Shaheed, I think, has unlocked a very interesting aspect of this offense as well. And so I do think you can buy into Derek Carr a little bit. Just a little bit. There, I even choked there. Just enough. We're not going to go too crazy on this one, but you are able to trust Derek Carr, I think, going forward. At the running back spot, Bucky Irving, 34% owned, the backup running back to Rachaad White for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And White, for the second week in a row, looked relatively ineffective. Now, Detroit's front 7 looked insane. Aiden Hutchinson was unbelievable in that game, almost setting the sack record for the Detroit Lions. And he, I think, single-handedly kind of blew up a lot of what Tampa Bay was looking to do. And so I don't know how much you can read into the running stats for that game. But I do think that, A, White is a little banged up, so I think that there is a path to some carries anyway. B, we've talked about it on here before. I don't know how great White is. And so I do think that this isn't This one, actually, a couple of ours aren't really Christian McCaffrey replacements necessarily. Because for the most part, like the guys who are getting a bunch of the carries are taken, right? So we are trying to manufacture a little bit. I think Irving is going to have a piece of this offense, and so I do think that he is someone that you can go out and that this one is a bit more of a longer term play. But I do think he is worth owning in fantasy leagues. Ty Chandler, this one, it's not going to feel like the Christian McCaffrey replacement if you weren't able to get Mason at the beginning of the year. But I do think there are more carries coming for Chandler. Aaron Jones has been effective so far with Minnesota, but Chandler has 21 opportunities through 2 games. And that I'm pretty sure most people calculate it like this, but the way I do is carries and targets. Now, that's only 3 targets, but that still means 18 carries in 2 weeks for Ty Chandler. One of the things we talked about coming into the year is do not undervalue the backup running back or the 1B in some of these running back situations. And it has paid off with Zach Charbonnet, and I think it's going to pay off with Ty Chandler. I think that there are going to be legitimate touches for him on a week in, week out basis. And so I think if you're looking at the waiver wire right now for a piece to just plug in and play for a Christian McCaffrey replacement or an Isaiah Pacheco replacement, you certainly can do that. I'm not putting Steele on this list. He is, I think, probably the straight line for Pacheco. And if you want to do that, fine. I haven't seen enough from him to buy into it. And when we did see him, he has had some good runs, but he's also had some fumble issues. And he is just a running back to me that is, and I could be wrong because we've only had limited run viewings of him. But A, he's not a running back, he's a fullback. But B, he kind of seems like a coach told me to run here, so I run here. And if there is no hole here, well, that's not my fault because the coach told me to run here. There's supposed to be hole here. He isn't really a create his own whatever. He is I'm going to get what is blocked for me. Now, I'm going to run very hard into that hole, and maybe by the fact of being a bowling ball, he's going to get a few more options. But I don't think that he is going to be nearly as effective as Pacheco is. And honestly, I don't think they are going to just straight up replace Isaiah Pacheco. I think that A, it's going to be a wild committee for the 6 to 8 weeks that Pacheco was gone. And B, I think it's going to be like a lot of sweeps with Xavier Worthy and quick little hitch passes and stuff like that. So honestly, the running back I would want in this scenario, and it's maybe that there's a confirmation bias because I ended up with P. Ryan in a couple of leagues, but I think it's Samaje P. Ryan because I think a lot of the run game is going to be quick little Patrick Mahomes passes to Samaje P. Ryan. And so I think his value goes up a little bit. The last one is Cam Akers, 1% owned, but he looked fine in the limited runnings that we saw with him with the Texans on Sunday against the Chicago Bears. He is not the explosive guy he was a couple of years ago. That is just how injuries work. But if Mixon's going to be out for any extended amount of time, I think he's the backup. Pierce is maybe a bit more of the appreciated name, but I think if this coaching staff trusted Pierce, they wouldn't have signed Mixon and Akers. So I think that Akers is going to be the guy, and it'll probably, if Mixon misses time, which it sounds like he's not going to miss significant time anyway, but if there is any games missed, I think Akers is probably going to be the 1A in a 1A, 1B situation with Pierce. You can maybe look at Pierce, who is banged up as well. So there might just be a wide open spot for Akers, at least this week. At wide receiver, it's Quentin Johnston, 7% owned, 11 targets in 2 weeks for LAC. He has been getting a lot of very good looks. He has been getting some good looks in the end zone as well. We all were kind of waiting to see who would be the main target with the LA Chargers, and it's only 2 weeks, so this might change. But for right now, Quentin Johnston feels like he is that guy. Now, this week's against Pittsburgh. I don't know how many looks you're going to get against Pittsburgh. This feels like a very low-scoring football game, but I do think Quentin Johnston should be that guy that you go out and try to get. Josh Reynolds is another one. 13 targets in 2 weeks with Bo Nix. Cortland Sutton, I think, is the most talented wide receiver out in Denver, and so I think as the season goes on, that's going to grow a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And I do think, like, being Sutton, I think he had double-digit targets in week 1 and only 4 in week 2. I do think part of that is Pittsburgh's defense kind of recognizing, like, hey, if we just cover that guy, we're probably good right? But there is at least a comfort level with Nix and with Reynolds. And I think there's going to be at least some opportunities for Nix to get Reynolds the ball. I do think Nix is going to get a little bit better. I don't think he's all that great. And I think Sean Payton is wildly overrated, but I do think that there are going to be at least a few opportunities for Reynolds in the offense to get this thing going. And then at 2%, it is Jawan Jennings. 9 targets in 2 weeks. Now that Samuel is out, he's the guy. He's the guy who steps in. Obviously, the hope would be Ricky Pearsall, but he is continuing to recover with what happened to him right before the season started. Brandon Ayuk hasn't really clicked in a couple of weeks. I do caution against thinking that this is going to just replace the Deebo Samuel targets. That's certainly not going to be the case. That this offense in general is not going to be as effective without Deebo and without Christian McCaffrey. But Jawan Jennings is at least fine and at least going to get some opportunities in what will still be a good offense. Moving to the tight end spot, there is just one. It's Mike Gesicki at 5% owned. He has 13 targets in 2 weeks. Burrow was absolutely looking for him. That this was a safety blanket for him. I don't think this is a full season thing. As Higgins gets healthier, gets more integrated in the offense, he's going to take, I think, a lot of these passes. But for now, he's not. So I think Gesicki is a real viable option. That there was a lot of work for him out there. And like he is not a dynamic tight end by any stretch of the imagination, but he's fine. We've seen him produce before. We can trust Mike Gesicki. And lastly, the defense. It's the Vegas Raiders. Again, I'm not going to tell you a whole lot of times this year to draft to pick up the Vegas Raiders defense, but they're facing Carolina this week, and I get Andy Dalton is stepping in for Bryce Young. I don't think a lot of the issues out in Carolina are necessarily the quarterback. Now, the quarterback isn't helping, but the offensive line sucks. The receivers are better, still not great. They're having trouble running the ball. This isn't a situation where it's, oh man, this team was a quarterback away. There are 22 starting positions out on the football field. Andy Dalton being the quarterback, I think, means that they are about 20 players away. This is a bad football team. And so I think the Raiders are going to be able to go out and really put up some fantasy points this week with Max Crosby taking advantage of a bit more of a statuesque quarterback in the backfield. And I do mean that in a negative way. So those are the fantasy football ads that I think you should do. If you have any questions about fantasy football, let me know in the chat, and we'll see if we can answer some of those.